Protecting your cake design using intellectual property law. Today on the show.
This is the Wedding Industry Law Podcast, a podcast dedicated to wedding professionals that are just trying to keep it legal. And now, your host, Rob Shank.
Hey out there, welcome back to the show. My name is Rob. I'm going to be your host. We're going to be talking today about how intellectual property law, that is to say copyrights, trademarks, patents, design issues, can help protect your unique cake designs. Now look, just because you're not a cake designer, just because you're not a baker or a gourmet, as it were, doesn't mean that this episode does not apply to you. There are lots of information and tidbits that could also pertain to your business. So I would recommend that you listen, even though this is directed specifically to cake designers. But we are not doing that alone. We are going to have a special guest, an intellectual property attorney named Hannah Brown, who I found because I stumbled across a very interesting article, which I will link in the show notes, about how copyrights, trademarks, trade dress, and other intellectual property categories can be used to protect cake design. Hannah Brown is an attorney at Gordon Reese Scully Mansucani and practices in the firm's intellectual property division in San Diego. Hannah attended the University of San Diego Law School and graduated in 2016. While in law school, she wrote a law review comment on the topic of intellectual property protection for cake design. As I mentioned, following law school, Hannah was a law clerk for 2 judges in federal courts in the Southern District of California. She is definitely the person to talk to with regard to protecting your cake design. So happy to have her on the show. Hannah, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
This is such an interesting and niche. I say niche as opposed to niche, but an interesting topic within a topic within a topic.
Mm-hmm.
I was scrolling through the internets one day and I came across your article. That's how I found you. So before we get into any of the of that paper, okay, which I think you can answer this if I think you did that as a 3L at school. But why? Like, what made you, of all the things that you could talk about in the world, in law school, in a paper, what made you talk about cake design?
So in law school, yeah, you're right. I think it was my second year of law school. Some students get invited to participate in this journal that's called Law Review. So I was a member of that. And as a member, you're required to write an article or what's called a comment on, some interesting issue in the law. And so you have to kind of pose this issue and pose a solution. So kind of, as you mentioned, there are a lot of issues, but a lot of those issues have been written on. So people have been writing articles for forever. So it's kind of difficult to come up with something that hasn't been written on, that, I'm opposing a solution that no one's really thought of before. So I was interested in intellectual property, and everyone knows that, if you have an invention or like a vaccine or something complicated, you can patent it, you can protect it. But what people don't really think about is that intellectual property is so broad. It can protect so many different artistic things. And so I was kind of thinking, oh, maybe there's things that people don't use to protect it. Maybe they don't really know that the law could help them. And so I kind of came across cake design as maybe that, because cakes can be considered artistic. They can be original, but from what I saw, people weren't using the law for it. And maybe they were getting frustrated that people were taking their designs and copying them and not giving them credit. So I kind of decided to write on that to give an insight into what people could do.
Excellent. That makes perfect sense. And for the listeners out there that aren't attorneys, which is probably 99.9% of the listeners, Hannah's being very modest. Law Review is for the brightest, the best and the brightest of all the law students. And then to have an article published is extra kudos on top of that. So Hannah is a smart cookie. So at any rate, so that's the history of the paper. This law with citations and everything, this law review article about cake design and intellectual property. Let's kind of get into it. Let's kind of peel back the onion. So from a broad standpoint, before we get into cake design itself, can you walk us through what intellectual property is and kind of like the main categories of it?
Sure. So yeah, there are a couple of pieces within it. One of them, as I mentioned, is patents, which is can be more of a complex thing, but there can also be design patents, which is, kind of as it sounds, protecting the design. Specifically, which I focused on a little more in my article, we also have copyright and trademark, and within trademark we have trade dress. And those are kind of the areas within intellectual property. They're all different in terms of what they protect. So specifically with copyright, it protects what we call a work of authorship that's in a tangible medium. So you're not protecting an idea that you have about something creative. You're protecting once you put that idea down on some sort of tangible medium. So for that, it has to be something that's original, but that's kind of a low bar. It just has to be some sort of minimal creativeness. Trademarks are different in that they don't have to be creative, they don't have to be artistic. So when we think of trademarks, we probably think of maybe like the Nike swoosh or the McDonald's arches. When you look at those, you don't necessarily think that's artistic or creative, but when you look at them, you think of the company that they are used for, and that means the trademark's doing its job. It's supposed to kind of indicate the source of the product. So when you look at it, you don't get confused of who put out this product. No, it's Nike because you see that swoosh. And then the last one within there is trade dress, which is similar to trademark in that it's it's identifying the source of the product, but trade dress really protects the overall image of the product. So how something looks as a whole. For example, like the Hershey's Kiss is a shape of something that's trade dressed. It's the overall image as a whole, but when you see it, that's the source of it.
Thank you for that. And so I guess if anybody out there wants to learn more about it, we've addressed these issues more at length than we're doing right now in previous episodes. I know that we had Sonia Lakhani on here talking about these things, but one of the main things that I would emphasize for the listener is that I would think of copyright as a protection of the artist's ideas for the artist to exploit those ideas, to sell them, to duplicate them, publish them, whatever the case may be. Whereas trademark is to protect you, the public, from confusion of where something is coming from. Those are the kind of like the overarching broad things. So, okay. All right. So that's copyright. That's trademarks, trade dress. Walk us through this. Like, what are some potential ways that, or not, that those particular intellectual property categories could protect a awesome cake?
Sure. So as I mentioned with copyright, it has to be something that's minimally creative or original. I think a copyright could protect a cake design as long as that design meets that criteria. Obviously, if you're only doing a simple square cake with red dots, maybe that's not creative and you can't use a copyright for it. I think for copyright, people think of a lot of just like 2D objects, like a painting or a picture, but that's not necessarily restrictive. There are 3D objects that have been protected as long as they meet that criteria. Trademark, it could also protect a design. Like I mentioned, the trademark must be, so let's say it must be used enough to identify a specific company. So you have to use the design enough, or you have to use it consistently to show that if someone sees that design, they're going to think of you. I think one of the criticisms of this is that a lot of cake designers maybe out there would think, well, I don't use the same design each time. My cake depends on my customer or the event, or, I use different colors for different things. And that's true. But I think if that's the case, then maybe trademark or trade dress isn't for you. But if you are someone that has some unique design that you're using consistently and you've thought of it, then it could be trademarked. And then if others are going to use that exact design, then they'd be copying you.
So let's get into actually to do this. So I often see on the Facebooks, on the Instagrams, cakes that feature copyrighted material. So maybe somebody's getting married that loves Chewbacca, or
Mhm.
Star Wars, or somebody that is big into SEC sports. And so there might be, a UT Vols symbol on there. What Hannah is talking about, and maybe Hannah can elaborate on this, but those are things that have copyright and trademark protections in and of themselves.
Mhm.
So we're talking about literally the design and look of that cake outside of any other things that might be protectable because they have their own rights attached to them. So I guess by way of example, a copyright would be can you give us an example of a copyright in a cake? Like what, you mentioned it can't just be square, it's got to be artistic. But is there can you give us kind of like a spectrum of where we're looking at in terms of something that could have copyright protection in cake design?
Yeah, I think in my research, I didn't find that cake designers were using copyright. So I don't think we have an example of, hey, this person has used a copyright. One of the, I think, most famous cakes that we know, there when the royal couple got married, they had a very famous cake that had a very specific look. I think something like that could be copyrighted because it's original. Or maybe if you have a cake that has, certain tiers that are different colors, or they're in different shapes a specific way. I think that is a better example of something that could be copyrighted. Again, it's kind of an amorphous standard of it has to be original. So, it's kind of hard to say what that means, but there have been things, like pieces of jewelry have been copyrighted because they're original, they're 3D objects, but they kind of meet that creativity
This is so
standard.
interesting because like this is something like I've never, I mean, at least for me, I've never thought about, but I guess it makes sense. It's an idea that someone's had. It's put into a medium, meaning it's a edible cake, and it's creative. Why couldn't it be copyrighted, right? So like I don't understand. Like that's interesting. So as long as there's at least some threshold of creativity in the creation of the cake, that it's not just some square 3-layer cake, chocolate, vanilla, or whatever, there's a possibility that you could theoretically copyright that thing. Now, um, I guess what we're talking about, and let me make another distinguishing thing or distinguishing note, is that this is separate and apart from the recipe itself. So this is something I literally just thinking of as we're talking, but recipes, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure recipes themselves are not able to be copyrighted, which is why they had to be put into vaults like the Coca-Cola formula. But I don't know. Am I wrong about that? I don't know. Like, is it?
Um, yeah, so recipes wouldn't be copyrighted, but there's a specific different area of intellectual property, which we haven't mentioned, which is trade secret, which is basically like a confidential proprietary thing within the company. And some recipes are protected by trade secret. For example, I think KFC, they use a specific spices on
The
their chicken.
11, Hannah, the 11 herbs and spices. Come on.
Of course.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that's trade secrets or something similar to that, where the company is making efforts to keep it secret, like you said, keeping it in a vault. That's a requirement for a trade secret, and it is some confidential thing that if a KFC employee leaves and goes and works at McDonald's, they can't then say, "Oh, hey, I have this secret recipe that I'm going to bring over," because it is protected for the company.
Right. And so I guess the bottom line with regard to copyright is that this is not something that's cut and dried or something that we see a lot. This is literally something that you wrote about, researched, and in everyday life, we're not seeing too many examples, if any of the examples of this exist. It's just a matter of like, it's a intellectual pursuit at this point, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of the point of me writing this. Is I think it's an industry where people don't think that they have, the ability to protect their work. And it's not for everyone. Obviously, I'm not saying go out there and copyright your cakes. Some people don't care that others are copying them. Some find it flattering.
Right.
But some people are frustrated by it and say, hey, I wish you would have given me credit for that.
Right.
And in that sense, there is a possibility to have legal rights to protect yourself.
Okay. And that's with the copyright. Now, with trademark, if I understand you correctly, this would have to be something that identifies you as the cake maker with the cake itself. Like, so for example, if like, well, all of my cakes, one side is purple, or, and so now everybody that gets a cake where one side is purple, they know that that's XYZ baker. Is that about right? Like, is that how we approach this?
Right. And I'm not saying that only, one color enough is to signify yourself. But yes, in that example, it'd be, so let's say I have a purple bottom tier, and then I always have a red second tier. And then my third tier is a triangle that's orange. Something that's specific enough that every time someone sees that, they think, oh, that's this company. That would be trademark because you're using it to identify yourself.
Right. So I get the people would know that's the source of that particular cake is XYZ brand.
Mhm.
That's kind of the idea. So it's not necessarily like that's why it's separate from copyright, which is an expression of an idea. This is something that protects the public from confusion about, where the cake came from. So
And
that
it protects the public, but it also protects you. So let's say someone out there is going to start using something very similar to you, and they're selling it for cheaper. The public is going to look at that and say, "Hey, I really, like XYZ company. They must be selling this for cheaper. I'm going to buy it." And then you, as the company, are saying, "Wait, that's not mine. You're using my good name to sell products." It's protecting you because you don't want the public to be confused and buy another person's product thinking that it's coming from you when it's not.
right. Okay. So that's the trademark component. That's maybe how we would approach that. And with regard to cake design, it would almost be like the and I don't know, but like it would almost be like the cake designer would have to do the same thing every time or do something outside of the cake making that lets the public know that this particular type of cake, the way it looks, is mine, right?
Right.
Okay. So take us then that's not too far apart from the actual trade dress. Like, does trade dress factor into cake design at all and protecting cake design?
Yeah, and that in this example, trade dress would be the same. Trade dress protects the overall appearance of something, so it would protect, or not protect it. It uses the overall appearance of something to identify that company. So in this example of that, specific looking cake, that would be trade dress.
And so let's say that for all the cake designers out there listening, they're like, well, man, I put a lot of work into these things, and there is an element of me in every one of these. And let's say that I want to trademark it. What is or let's say even copyright, either one. What are the remedies out there if they have gone through that process and have done it? How can they stop copycats? Like, what is that process like?
Yeah, so that's I wouldn't recommend someone try this by themselves. The trademark registration process can be tricky, so getting legal help is probably a good idea if you're interested in it. But then once you do have it, then you kind of have that ability to either send, informally send a letter to someone and saying, "Hey, I have this registered trademark, see attached, and you're copying it, and I request you stop." So sometimes that's enough, and sometimes it's not, and you have to sue. And in that sense, then you can recover. It kind of depends, damages based on how much they've earned, how much you've lost, or just a standard set amount of damages. So you do kind of have that ability to recover it back if it is found that you are successful.
That makes sense. And I mean, this might seem far-fetched to some people, but maybe not others. I mean, like I know in the wedding industry, it's somebody that's a trendsetter, their thing might get picked up by like Hallmark or some other industry and get mass produced, and it dilutes their own brand, or, they don't get any credit for it. So, who knows? You might have invented the next Little Debbie snack cake or the next Twinkie,
Mhm.
you want to protect that. So that makes sense. So this is so interesting. Like, I mean, when we think of trademarks, we usually just think of logos or, brands and stuff like that. We don't think about how it applies possibly to things like this. So that's been super interesting for me. So, um, Hannah, I'm going to put your paper in the show notes. If anybody's interested in reading further into this topic, it's a great paper. I mean, I wish that let's see, I was probably last in my class. So like there's no way I could have made law review, but I love to read law review articles.
Mhm.
It's an excellent one. Um, but at any rate, that'll be in the show notes if you want to read. And Hannah, if somebody out there is interested in trademarks, I believe that's something that is one of your practice areas. So if they wanted to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
Yeah, and you can put my email in the show notes as well. It's hbrown@grsm.com. And if you want to put that in there, then if anyone has any questions or needs any help, then I'm happy to help.
Fantastic. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I guess you can say when it comes to intellectual property and cake design, let them eat cake. I don't know. I was trying to think of a cake analogy, but I failed miserably. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the content of this program today. New episodes of the Wedding Industry Law podcast come out every single Monday, usually in the morning sometime. You can catch it on YouTube. You can catch it on anywhere you get your podcast from, or our website, weddingindustrylaw.com. While you're on YouTube, while you're listening to the podcast, like and subscribe. That would be fantastic. If you have any wants or desires in terms of topics that you would like to see covered, please let me know. Reach out to me. I will address it in an upcoming episode. And with that, folks, we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Wedding Industry Law Podcast. This podcast is intended for general information only. Nothing in this podcast is intended to be legal advice. Do not rely on this podcast for your legal matter. Instead, consult an attorney in your area. Thanks, obrigada, até semana que vem.